Somebody say, worship anyway. Worship anyway. You don't need no music. Worship anyway. Bless him anyway. Praise him anyway.
Hi, and welcome to another episode, if you will, of Hope from the Helm. We are thankful that you've tuned in with us to be blessed by a conversation. And usually, of course, I'm standing up behind a podium or otherwise, but today I thought it prudent for us as we move further into this Christmas season to talk about the grief that we often share at what should be the most happiest time of the year. And so a lot of people, as they anticipate having a blue Christmas, I thought it wonderful for us to think about how to cope with grief in this season. And very thankful to have with us Dr. Gabrielle Banks, who is no stranger to the Mount Helm family, but for those who may not know you, just tell our audience a little bit about who you are, what you do.
Okay. I am a clinical psychologist at the University of Mississippi Medical Center. Specifically, I work at the Children's Hospital at a clinic called the Center for Advancement of Youth, which is a developmental behavioral clinic that is under the umbrella of the Children's of Mississippi system. I am a Jackson native, and I am a member of Hope Spring Missionary Baptist Church, pastored by Reverend Samuel Thompson. I split my time because I also am most certainly a member of the Helm family. My work in general from a day-to-day, on a day-to-day basis is half developmental assessments for young children who are presenting with developmental delays or concerns, and the other half is behavior therapy specifically for mostly in the early childhood age range, so working with children who have behavior difficulties, but I also get to work with children in the late middle childhood, early adolescence range, working with anxiety and depression and adjustment difficulties as well.
Wow. So with that, let's talk about, first of all, kind of the definition of grief, and if that shows up differently, say for a child, adolescent, a senior adult.
Yes, definitely. So grief is specifically it's a normal response to the loss of a person or loved one or experience. Separate from adjustment, which is just adjustment to a change that may encompass loss as well, but grief is the specific response to a loss. It definitely presents itself across the developmental timeline. In children, it presents itself differently, and it can start to present itself differently in adults and older adults. We also see some differences in that presentation as well.
Wow. What are some of those uniquenesses or differences between each generation?
So we can start with infancy and early childhood. Are super early humans. So these are pre-verbal children. That development of language is a very big milestone for a number of reasons. One of those reasons is their ability to communicate their feelings. But those children who are pre-verbal generally express grief and loss or distress by becoming maybe more clingy or wanting to be closer to their relative after there's been a change or a loss in a relative, especially if that's a traumatic loss. Even in small infants, we see lethargy, changes in feeding, or even in extreme cases, failure to thrive. And one of the main things to remember in this age group is because these babies are reacting to the experiences of their caregivers. And so when caregivers are experiencing distress, the way they interact with their child is changed and altered, and their child does feel that. They don't have the words to express it.
So let's pause there. So is it that the infant is responding to what seems to be behavioral change? Or are they also picking up on chemicals and
That's a really good question. I think that both of those things can happen. We know that especially mothers and nursing mothers can have chemical changes that can be passed on to the child. We know that in utero, children can experience the stress that their mothers are experiencing as well. So less so kind of feeling the vibe or that kind of chemical osmosis, but more so it can be biologically passed on. But I think the form of what you said in terms of the behaviors that they're seeing in that response to the parent would be there's lots of evidence to support those changes.
Wow. That's even interesting to think how attentive an infant is to what may be a minor shift in maybe the way the parent or caregiver holds them or doesn't hold them.
Exactly.
And they're already aware. Something's not
the
the same.
warmth, the smile, the lack of a smile, because we know that early on infants respond to social smiles and they return your smile, but imagine if no one was smiling at you. Or imagine if your mother or father was less responsive than they had been before, so you're crying for a little bit longer. Now, of course, the infant is not saying, I'm crying for a little bit longer, I don't understand what's happening, but they are experiencing that stress for a longer amount of time than they had in the past.
Wow.
Now, moving on to our verbal preschoolers. Now, these children experience death in a different way, in that they're still kind of fairly egocentric, but they don't quite understand the cause and effect part of death, and they may start to fill in the blanks. So, this person died because I was mad at them, or I said something mean and that's why they died. And so that's why in this age range, even though it may be uncomfortable, it's very important to communicate openly with your children about death. And when we think about it, they see death all the time. If they happen to walk in and someone's on the news and they're watching the news and they hear about death, but Mufasa died in The Lion King.
Wow.
In Frozen, Elsa and Anna's parents died. And so these themes are very present in their life. We can use these opportunities to talk with them a little bit more about what our family believes and what our spiritual family believes happens when we die. So there are definitely opportunities to have those conversations to fill in the blanks with children who don't quite understand. When we move into middle childhood and early adolescence, kind of that tween or preteen age range, they're starting to understand the finality and the finality of death and how permanent it is, and also understanding the biological changes as well. In both of these age ranges, once the grief is tied to their understanding of death, and so once you are understanding that this person is going away or has gone away and they're not coming back, then we start to shift and see that we start to see the shift in emotionality. There's a shift in how they are expressing themselves, and the grief generally presents itself in sometimes changes in appetite, changes in sleep patterns, lots of physical symptoms. So we'll hear a lot of reports of stomach aches or headaches. These are and there's no medical cause. A lot of times families will take children to the doctor, say, well, his stomach is hurting, and the doctor's just saying, we're not really seeing a reason why his stomach should hurt. That does not mean the stomach ache is not real. It just means that the stomach ache has a cause that's not necessarily medical.
Yeah.
You'll also see in that age range just excessive crying, excessive emotionality, and all of this, again, if it's grief, it's normal. And it's normal for a very long time. This may be the presentation of a child, and it's within the context of a major loss, and that will be appropriate. Now, grief in adolescence starts to take another turn, because adolescence is also a time when there are a lot of biological changes within the child or within the teen. This is also known as an age of high self-centeredness, and you're realizing your power, the things that your body can do. You start to think about death as more of a concept, and you're starting to understand that what if this happened, what if that happened, what if the treatments do work, what if the treatments don't work in the context of cancer treatment for a loved one. And so now you're compounding your changing body, your changing biology with understanding, again, your understanding of the biology of death, and also your understanding of how your emotions are working. And so sometimes grief looks, in addition to what we see with the younger children, with lots of with crying and somatic complaints, it also means you're experimenting with risky behaviors. So it could be experimenting with drugs and alcohol, experimenting with risky sex behaviors, and we see children reaching for some type of pulling towards riskier behaviors that they hadn't pulled for in the past, and that could be a grief response. And again, this is all within the context of thinking what has recently happened in this child's life or in this teen's life. You also see that there may be more of a fascination with death, and there's a fascination with sensationalized deaths, so deaths by suicide. Maybe there's more fascination there. Romantic deaths, like in Titanic or Romeo and Juliet, there's that fascination there. Or even or tragic deaths like school shootings. There's more of a push to talk about those things, or interest and questions about those things, and that can even start in the earlier years as well, in middle childhood. The school age children, 4th and 5th graders, they're also asking lots of questions about those things as well. But that is another marker that this is all a part of that grief response.
Wow. So one of the things I wanted to tease out is, you talk about death as a concept in the teen years, but how in each of those other moments there are different kinds of deaths that can occur that provoke a grief response. So for instance, when you were talking about like a 6 or 7-year-old and they're dealing with loss, think about, the first thing I thought about was divorce or relocation of some kind. You're no longer with your friends, and how, during this pandemic, there have been those kinds of losses, be they, in terms of relationships or the loss of the familiar, of certain particular rhythms that one expects, and that plays out differently, as you noted, at different ages and stages. Would those reactions, those kind of grief responses, be similar in, say, the 10-year-old, if it's a physical cessation of life of a person and a kind of immaterial loss? Would it show up similarly, or would the 10-year-old, for instance, be able to know that there's a difference in this kind of loss in comparison to this loss, though they're both tragic?
That's a great question, and I think it really does depend on the 10-year-old. I think those patterns aren't quite as clear because, as you said, there may be some 10-year-olds may respond differently if dad moves across the street versus dad moves across the country, or they may respond very similarly. I think the one key change is that. One key similarity is that there's definitely a loss in terms of your expectations for the future, the way you thought things would go, and the way it was all planned out. That is now shattered for some reason. Sometimes children also need that additional help from adults and helping professionals to say, well, and not to remind them, oh, well, your mom isn't dead or your dad isn't dead, but to help them cope in a different way, where it's, well, this is what the new plan is now. This is how you will continue to visit your father. This is how you'll continue to see your mother on the weekends. Now, what's interesting is that what we sometimes see in terms of just more so, it's not necessarily, maybe it's a grief response, maybe it's an adjustment response, but it's a change in their functioning, and that change in functioning can very much be similar. You can definitely start to see changes in school performance, changes in peer relationships, and as I talked about, changes in appetite and sleep patterns. Again, these are changes that let us know that something is amiss, and that the child may need help processing this change, because the change has impacted their day-to-day functioning. But it really can look the same. Yeah.
When you talk about the ways in which teenagers, for instance, grieve, cope, that really sounded very similar to what many adults do.
Yeah.
So what before, it seemed like there were kind of mental and physical developmental stages for why an infant or a toddler or 10-year-old responded differently. But it almost seems as if, this is just, generally speaking, once you hit about 15, some of those same things can be with you at 15, 25, 55, 85. Why is there sort of continuity in terms of risky behaviors, risky sex or drugs, alcoholism, we see a lot in adults. What's going on there in terms of the continuity between childhood development, adolescent development, and adulthood?
Well, with the adolescent development, that's the time when we all solidified kind of who we wanted to be. We did all this exploring, and then we solidified who we wanted to be, and also we decided who we wanted to be based on the adults that we saw, and also our peers, but also the adults that we looked up to. And so we start to see this crystallization of personality and crystallization of certain behaviors and how we respond to certain life events that may or may not be very similar to what we've seen before and what's modeled for us. And so that's part of where that continuity comes from. And after the adolescent age, now, thank God, after that, there is still change and there's room for growth beyond that adolescent age. But there is but again, you start to see these patterns definitely start to solidify. And so a lot of times we hear about people with substance use difficulties that started with started using substances to cope in early in the adolescent, or sometimes in the early adolescent, age range. And so that kind of chemical dependency, to use that term, started a long time ago. And so, and it worked. And so because it worked as a behavior, I said because it worked, we kept on doing it because it was reinforcing in some way, we kept on doing it. And so that's part of why that continues. One concern though is that in certain families, if you're a teenager and you start experimenting with these risky behaviors, there's someone to kind of shut it down. For adults, if we respond this way, if we have a grief response and respond with increasing risky behaviors, there's no one there to shut it down often. And so it can be definitely, it can take even more of a turn for us because we don't have mothers hanging over us. Some of us don't have them anymore. Another piece that we see with adults is also an avoidance. So avoidant coping. I don't want to talk about this anymore. I don't want to go to the places that my wife or my child or my mother or father used to go because it reminds me too much of them and it's far too painful. Again, within a grieving period, that's most certainly understandable. The question that we ask is this grief then impacting your ability to engage with life in a way that brings you joy, in a way that brings you meaning? Sometimes people say, well, I just moved away and I don't have to deal with it anymore. And sometimes you aren't able to come to church on a certain day because, or specifically, you won't come to church on Mother's Day because Mother's Day is a difficult day for you. And so, and is that something you can integrate into your life? Or is it something that really is causing difficulty because your children would like for you to come to church on Mother's Day? And then that's when we have to decide. That's one example of deciding whether or not your response is negatively impacting your life in a way that needs to change. So I took your question to a different
oh, that's fine.
Different road.
But it actually connects then to kind of the next segment, which deals with particularly this time of the year. It's the holiday season. Christmas is coming up in a couple of weeks, and we're doing this in the midst of a pandemic. So you've got some people, members of our church, members of the audience who are watching us around the country, who have experienced some grave loss. They've lost a parent, a spouse, a child in this year, either to COVID, to cancer, to some kind of gun violence or whatever. And then in the space of that, trying to navigate not having been able to literally be with them at the time of death because of COVID medical restrictions, etc. What are some of, and I guess you've really spoken to this, but what are some of those things we should be looking for in our parent or spouse or friend who may be avoiding or maybe trying to say I'm okay, or workaholic, trying to I'm going to just work my way through it. I guess I'm answering my own question. What are some things we should be looking? What are some things we should be looking for to say how can we be present with them as they go through the grieving process? Yes,
Definitely. So I think what you touched on is kind of that absence of the performance of grief. So when a person is not, you don't see this person grieving, that is also a cause for concern because grief is so normal. And so if there's I'm fine, we're just going to keep on going, that can be indicative of an avoidant coping style that may not, that may not be helpful. I use with a lot of my families, I use the analogy of putting things under your bed. So if your mother tells you to clean up your room, you keep putting things under your bed and put things under your bed, and then one day that bed is lifting off the ground because you've put so many things underneath the bed, and then the bed falls over, right? So, or you just you suck in so much air that you pop because you've tried to gloss over your grief. So that is one thing to definitely look into or to look for. But again, definitely changes in mood, changes in irritability, increasing in behaviors that you see may have occurred occasionally, but now there's a lot more of the not only risky behaviors, but it's kind of self-medicating behaviors, and sometimes that means spending more money than you normally spend. Because that's a way to fill a void, and sometimes that may mean drinking more than you've been drinking before, because that's a way of filling the void. So, and that means not reaching out to people that you've normally been able to communicate with. And so you mentioned parents that are living in different locations, and so if they haven't called you, you want to make sure that you're calling them and checking in. One thing about the older generation and older generation of people that look like us, the older generation folks in the African American community, these are not going to be people who are going to say, "Oh, I'm so sad. I'm really feeling depressed, and I'm really feeling." Now, some of them do, but it's not as common. More so, it may manifest itself in pain. So, kind of similar to what happens, what we talked about with the younger children. If you don't have the words to express what your feelings are, if you don't have those feelings words, a lot of times it can come out as my back is aching, I have a headache, I have a stomach ache, the aches and pains that I normally have, like, oh, Arthur is jumping on me, but Arthur is sticking with me, and the kind of those, and for longer than I expected, and those heightened pain complaints is another way.
Wow.
Again, loss of appetite and loss of and sleep disturbance. Sleep disturbance is one of the main symptoms of a disturbance in mood and worries. And it's very common. So people who worry a lot lose sleep. People who are depressed also lose sleep. People who are grieving also lose sleep. And so making sure that we're checking in about these normal functions is one way to jump in. One of the things I'll say is lack of interest in things that they have been interested in before.
Right.
Making sure that they're still at least, and that's hard because if one of those things is going bowling lanes are closed, and so are they still interested in watching bowling? Are they still interested in talking about that? Are they still able to find some joy in some things? And they may need us to come in and try to be creative and helpful to figure out some new things that can bring them joy.
Yeah. Speaking about those sort of things you do to bring joy in the pandemic, one of the things that has happened has been many of our churches have prudently stopped in-person services. I was speaking to someone just the other day that earlier on in the year, March, April, May, there was like, okay, we can make the adjustment. We'll watch the thing on the TV. But now we're at the end of the year. We're possibly moving into 2021 without much shift in the pandemic. And for a lot of people, young or old, but especially older folks for whom the sanctuary provides a certain kind of stability in ways that everything else has changed, their inability to be in the building maybe heightens the sense of disconnection or loss or whatnot. So you got the loss of a loved one, and then the loss of what was familiar in terms of here's my in-person community that would walk with me, hold my hand, put a hand on the shoulder. But even if we were in person, we're not touching, or we shouldn't be, right? So what should that person do? A younger person who may have lost a family member, an older person who's lost a family member, do when particularly the church space, the worship space, is not an available refuge?
And so I think I'm going to defer to you for some of this too. I think that there are different ways to be creative in how we recreate that space, and sometimes that may mean if you have a recording of just voices of people in the church, if you have recordings of singing, maybe you're playing those recordings. If you have room or space in your house where you can create a space where you look up and you see these pieces of art or colors or furniture that reminds you of your worship space, if you can create that worship nook in one corner of your living room or a worship room where that's where you come and you create that, as that's where you're going to go, and that's where you're going to commune with God, and that's when you have those and that may mean that you pull in pieces from the reminders of your loved one, if you are able to do that at this time. So given that fresh loss and grief does mean that it may be too painful to do some things, but we do the same way we would we recommend this for children, we recommend this for adults. It's okay to discuss the memories. It's okay to mourn. It's okay to cry when you're remembering the good times. It's okay to cry when you're remembering the times that you regret. That when things you said that you regret saying, it's okay to talk about those things too. And I'm gonna toss the ball over to you because I think that in that space that you've created where you're communing with the Lord, those are things that I believe you can bring to the Lord as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, absolutely great. I mean, 1 Peter 5:7 says, "Cast your cares upon the Lord, for He cares for you." And you said something earlier too about older men, which I see this even among younger African American professionals, particularly men, but sometimes working women. The inability to express verbally what's going on, so you try to cover it up. And that 1 Peter 5:7 passage is such a transparent one that says it is okay to acknowledge that you have cares that are too heavy for you to carry, right? Too heavy for you to carry alone.
Right.
And so various ways of doing that. Sometimes that's verbalizing that with another person on the phone. Sometimes it's writing that out. I love what you said about the creative ways, particularly in terms of creating kind of a worship nook. I actually like that language. But maybe even recording a video, if you can do that, or writing a letter, expressing some of those things that you may regret, to kind of give that sense of release. Because I think you said something that really prompted this. A lot of times our grief is not just in terms of their loss, the loss of the individual, but so much of what we lost is just the time we didn't have to make things right.
Yeah.
If I'd only visited you more, if I'd only called a few more times, right? And sometimes you may need to work through that because, and I see this connection back to like not infancy, but toddler. A lot of times we blame ourselves for things that are beyond our control.
Yes.
Right? So 6-year-old, 7-year-old experiencing some kind of devastation is my fault. If I weren't here, this wouldn't happen. If I'd only been there at age 30, 60, 80, if I'd only been there, this wouldn't have happened.
Right.
Well, we don't know what would have happened if you were there. But kind of working through that. I mean, does that make sense?
Yes, that definitely makes sense. I think, and I recently saw, now, he's not a biblical scholar, but I believe Lenny Kravitz recently.
Okay, the prophet Lenny Kravitz said, all right.
He talked about how his relationship with his father was able to continue to evolve even after his father's passing. So just because someone was not physically present didn't mean that their relationship could not grow. And that's based on the power of the Spirit, right? Just because someone is not physically with you does not mean that there's not a presence that's still left with you that you can still reconcile with. And I think that is something that this is also not my professional opinion, but that's something that's definitely facilitated by the Holy Spirit. Because when you're focusing on your love and that relationship that you have with that person, that was a gift from the Holy Spirit. He also enables you to work through it, even though just like we work through our relationship with the Holy Spirit that we can't see right now.
Right. So let's make that turn in our final segment then, because you've given a wonderful expert professional opinion. One of the things we said before we started on camera is there's so many people who in the church world haven't worked through their things because they don't necessarily trust therapists, psychologists, behavioral specialists, etc. And you'll hear this sort of what's actually been more and more common now, saying I love Jesus and the therapist kind of thing, right? But for those who still haven't gotten there, it's like I hear all this of you saying, but that ain't Bible, right? If you don't mind sharing a little bit about your own kind of personal faith journey and how that informs the way that you do your work, and how how that helps to facilitate how you understand and minister, if you will, to people who are dealing with grief.
Yes. Well. First off, I mean, what I'm very fortunate enough to say is I was a Christian before I became a psychologist, so I'm able to that's definitely informed the way I've walked through my profession. And when it comes from just being in academia, and we talked before about how, you know, a lot of academics don't know them, and so are unfamiliar, and you know, of their own volition, they're unfamiliar, and so but for me, there's a level of care and compassion. There's a level of unconditional positive regard that as a helping mental health professional that I need to have every day for the families and children that I'm of service to. There's also there's also information that I receive from families, information I hear, things that would make anyone despair. And you have families who are coming in despair, but that's a load that's also shared in the space of my office or clinic. And so for me, my relationship with Christ also just kind of bolsters my strength, gives me the strength to continue to push through compassion fatigue that we have at times. It also gives me the strength to make sure and gives me some perspective on making sure that I'm providing culturally responsive care, making sure that when I have individuals who are coming into my office who don't share the same faith as me, I know that I'm called to be not only just respectful, but to be compassionate and to be affirming in their faith, because that's how I would like to be affirmed in my faith as a person of faith. I also believe that for the things that we tell our patients to do, so that work, because therapy is not just coming and talking, it's work. And that's where I think that we sometimes have difficulty reconciling, like, who's gonna do this work now? I already prayed, so God's gonna do that work, right? So I think you preached on, like, all you have to do is a little bit and God's gonna finish, but you still have to do a little bit. And so there's still work that we have to do, because He gave you a mind, He gave you some insurance to be able to let you have insurance to pay for somebody to come talk to you, and a mind to work these things out through. So one thing for me, even as I reconcile my own maintaining my own mental health, it's I'm praying for strength, and I'm praying for strength, and I'm praying for guidance. We're recognizing that kind of that old adage, you don't have to move the mountain, but just give me the strength to climb. So you don't have to move this mountain of anxiety, you don't have to move this mountain of grief, but if you can give me the strength to climb it, to work with it, if you can connect me with some people who can give me some tools to climb this mountain, that's all God working in your life. And so it's not, you are not abandoned. This is a big mask. You're not abandoned. You're not abandoning Christ, and you're not abandoning His work and not taking Him as His word just because you are helping. You're also moving through and walking through the doors that He's provided for you, in the same way that you're not abandoning Christ when you let somebody else feed you. You're not abandoning Christ when you go to work and let somebody pay you, right? So if God is sustaining us, but we take it as, well, He's sustaining us, but I still need to go to work. Well, He's sustaining you, and you still would benefit from therapy.
Wow, that's really good. And I'll close with this. I mean, you touched on the fact you are an essential worker, and so many of us in the helping professions, helping vocations, be as pastors or therapists or nurses or doctors, are overwhelmed in this season of the pandemic, especially we move into this, holiday season. And so, one of the things you pointed out, just as much you're helping others, you got to make sure you're maintaining your own mental health. And so maybe let's close with, what are certain ways of self-care in this season, especially with the pandemic, that any one of us, regardless of our station in life, can try to engage in?
One of the first things is just take your time. If you have time, take your time. If you have 5 minutes to do something that just makes you physically feel better, like taking off your shoes, sitting down, having a seat, that rest in your body is one of the first steps to resting in your mind. There's a reason why we talk about deep breathing and muscle relaxation, because we're sending signals to our mind that we just need to turn off. Sometimes it also means, sometimes if you're having thoughts that keep on racing, that sometimes can mean taking your mind off of something by taking your mind off of all the things that need to be done by watching some mindless television or listening to your favorite song, getting out and going for a walk. If it's too cold, trying a push-up, laughing at yourself for your inability to do that push-up, but just shaking things up. For families who are experiencing grief, one thing or a number of things that we can do with children is making sure that we're getting back to some type of routine, having some type of expectations for the children. But as a part of that routine, it's built-in time where you all are having fun with each other. And it's scheduled time to have fun. So it's not whenever we get to it, because it can take a long time to get to it. But if we schedule a family game night or a family dance night, or if we schedule that we're going to cook together, that's helpful. You also, as you're taking care of yourself, you're making sure you're taking care of your children by, specifically with grief, asking them questions about how they are experiencing their grief. No question should be off limits. Pay attention to what they are asking and what they're not asking. So along the same lines as this, you have to make sure that as a grieving adult, you're prepared for it. And sometimes it means you're just creeping along and getting better and better so that you can get better and better for your child. So you're working on yourself to make sure that your child is able to process this experience well. We don't want to not take care of ourselves, and so then we kind of brush things under the rug when it seems like our child is doing okay, but it's not. But the child is not doing well. So that's another push to do all the things we talked about. Relax, take a seat, plan fun activities, and try and stick with a routine that includes those fun activities. All these things adults are doing to take care of themselves, and that creates space for them to be able to be emotionally present, to check in with children who are experiencing that same grief that their parents are experiencing.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. I hope this has been as enlightening for everyone else as it has been for me. And if people want to connect with you, particularly those who have small or mid-sized children that may want to lean on your services, how can they do that?
So I can be found at the Center for Advancement of Youth. There's we have a K Facebook page. We also, so CAYK. If you Google UMMC Center for Advancement of Youth, that's also a way to get in touch with me. Directly, I'm definitely happy to share resources with families, to also help families determine if their child does need to seek services and point them in the right direction. If you want to reach out to me on Facebook, I'm Gabrielle Banks on Facebook, and I'm happy to help direct people in the right direction, direct them in the right direction for services there.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you so much for tuning in. I hope indeed you've been hoped and helped with Hope from the Helm. God bless you.
Here is a prayer taken from the Lamenting Psalms that you can pray if you need God's comfort. Dear Father, I come before you today with a heavy heart. Sadness overwhelms me. I feel surrounded by a dense fog that I fear will never lift. Like David, my tears have been my food day and night. Psalm 42:3. For however long this season of sorrow lasts, I pray that you would show me more of your love and grace. Help me not to run from whatever you want to do in my heart. Help me to trust that you are at work and to rest in your faithfulness. I want to say along with David, I will be glad and rejoice in your love, for you saw my affliction and knew the anguish of my soul. Psalm 31:7. Father, grant me gospel joy. Help me to rejoice in Christ even as I grieve. Envelop me with the peace and comfort only you can provide. As the days move into months, may this burden lessen. As the months move into years, use me to encourage and bless someone else who must walk a similar path. Help me to point them to you as the God of all comfort. In Jesus' name, amen.